Now, the disclosure files, we're going to continue with that. The pilots who saw the unknown. There are moments in history where someone sees something they cannot explain. Sometimes the answer comes quickly. Sometimes it takes years, and sometimes the question still remains. Now, in 2004, a group of United States Navy pilots encountered something over the Pacific Ocean, an object they couldn't identify. Now, it appeared to move in ways that challenged their understanding of conventional aircrafts, and then it simply disappeared. Now, more than a decade later, military pilots operating off the East Coast began reporting strange objects in their training area. Not once, not twice, but again and again. Now, these weren't amateur sky watchers, they were fighter pilots, men and women trained to recognize aircraft, trained to interpret radar, trained to understand the sky around them. And eventually, two of these pilots would sit before the United States Congress. One would describe the encounter that became known as the Tic Tac. The other would describe repeated encounters that he believed represented a serious aviation safety problem. Now, think about that for the moment. A serious aviation safety problem. Their names were Commander David Fravor and Ryan Graves. And this is their story. Right now, previously on Disclosure Files, we followed the extraordinary story of former intelligence officer David Grusch, a man who had spent years working inside the American intelligence community. Now, according to Grusch, his official work brought him into contact with individuals who claimed knowledge of highly classified UAP programs. He alleged that these programs involved the recovery and analysis of objects of unknown origin. And he made an extraordinary claim. He said that he had been informed of the recovery, what he described as non-human biologicals. And there was an important distinction. Grusch did not claim that he personally examined these biological materials. He was describing information that he said had been provided to him by individuals he regarded as credible. Now, his testimony raised enormous questions, but there was two other witnesses sitting beside him that day, and their stories come from somewhere very different. Their stories come from the cockpit. His name's David Fravor, former United States Navy commander, an experienced fighter pilot, and the man at the center of one of the most famous UAP encounters ever reported. Then you've got Ryan Graves, right, a former Navy F-18 fighter pilot and instructor, a man who said military aviators have been encountering unidentified objects repeatedly during training operations. Their stories don't begin in Washington. They began thousands of feet above the ocean. And to understand, we have to go back to November 2004. It's the Pacific Ocean. The USS Nimitz, right? The USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group was operating off the coast of Southern California. Now, for the pilots involved, it was a military training exercise, basically routine until it wasn't. Now, according to accounts later provided by persons involved in the incident, radar operators above the USS Princeton had been detecting unusual contacts. Right, think about that for a moment, right? Detecting unusual contacts during exercises. Now, objects appeared to be descending rapidly from high altitude, and according to these accounts, they were returning repeatedly. Now, eventually, pilots were sent to investigate. Among them was the commanding officer of Strike Fighter Squadron 41, Commander David Fravor. Now, Fravor was an experienced military aviator. His profession depended upon him recognizing aircrafts, understanding their capabilities, and knowing when something in the sky didn't make sense. Now, on this particular day, something didn't make sense. Fravor and the other pilots approached the area. They were directed towards something happening below them. Now, the ocean appeared disturbed. white water basically, and above it something was moving, a small white object, smooth, elongated, and without the obvious characteristics of a conventional aircraft. Fravor would later compare its appearance to a Tic Tac, right? And that's where the famous Tic Tac saying comes from. The pilots began manoeuvring. Fravor descended. The object reacted. He continued. He continued doing his thing. It moved again. And according to his later accounts, the object appeared to maneuver in a way he found extremely unusual and then accelerated away. The encounter lasted only minutes, but those few minutes would eventually become one of the most discussed military UFO incidents of the modern era. And the story wasn't over, because another Navy aircraft was about to record something, the Tic Tac footage, right? I'll play it there, right? The footage lasts only a short time, and at first glance, it doesn't look particularly dramatic. A grainy infrared image, a distant object, a few seconds of movement. And yet, this footage would eventually become one of the most famous pieces of UAP evidence ever released by the United States government. And as you know, it's become known as Flir 1 or the Tic Tac video. Now, there is something important to understand here, and I have to go through this, right? Commander David Fravor was not the pilot who recorded the famous infrared footage. The footage came from a subsequent Navy aircrew involved in the broader Nimitz incident. Fravor's importance comes from his direct visual encounter with the object. The video provides another piece of evidence as well, a different evidence, different perspective. Same broader incident, at least according to the accounts of those involved. Now, in April 2020, the Department of Defense officially authorized the release of 3 previously circulating Navy videos. One of them was recorded in November 2004. The other 2 came from 2015. The Pentagon confirmed that the videos were genuine Navy footage, but it did not say that they showed extraterrestrial spacecraft. Instead, the official position was much narrower, and of course it would be, right? The phenomenon shown in the videos remained unidentified, and that distinction is crucial. The footage is real, the interpretation remains open. So, what did Fravor see then? Fravor has spent years describing what he believes happened that day, but he has never needed to say, I saw an alien spacecraft. His position is considerably simpler. He saw something he couldn't identify, and he believed its behaviour was inconsistent with the aircrafts he knew. Now, that doesn't prove it's an extraterrestrial explanation. I personally think it is, right? But it does leave us with a genuine question. Well, if it wasn't extraterrestrial, what was it? Was it a conventional aircraft? No, it wasn't. Was it a classified military platform? No, it wasn't. Was it a drone? If it was extremely sophisticated. A sensor phenomenon, maybe. A misidentification? No, it wasn't that. It was something else. Personally, I think it was. The evidence available publicly does not provide a definitive answer, and that's where the skeptical argument becomes important, because unusual doesn't automatically mean extraterrestrial, does it? But unexplained doesn't automatically mean imaginary either. Right, so let's talk about the other pilot. More than a decade passed, the location changed, the aircraft changed, but the mystery didn't disappear. It just became larger. This time the story moved to the east coast of the United States, and another Navy pilot began hearing reports. Now, his name was Ryan Graves. Ryan Graves was an F-18 fighter pilot and an instructor. Like Fravor, he was trained to operate one of the world's most sophisticated fighter aircrafts. But according to Graves, something strange was happening in the training environment. Pilots were encountering objects that could not confidently be identified. At first, an isolated report might be dismissed, eh? Let's call it a radar anomaly, a distant aircraft, a drone or a balloon possibly, a sensor problem, perhaps nothing more important. right? But Graves said the reports continued, and eventually they became a pattern. For Graves, they created a very different question, right? Not are aliens visiting Earth? That's not the question he was interested in. But what is operating in our airspace? Because an unidentified object doesn't need to be extraterrestrial to be dangerous. It only needs to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, for a fighter pilot traveling at 100 miles an hour, an unexpected object in the flight path can become a serious threat. And that was one of the reasons Graves becomes such an important voice in the UAP discussion. He wasn't simply asking people to believe in UFOs. That wasn't the part he was interested in. He was asking the military to take the reports seriously, collect the data, analyse the encounters, and give pilots a professional way to report what they were seeing. Because it's dangerous, right? These are operating in restricted airspace. So, the cube inside the sphere. One of the encounters described by Graves is particularly strange. Pilots reported seeing an object described as a dark grey or black cube inside a transparent sphere. The pilots reportedly encountered it during training operations, and one aircraft came extremely close enough that the encounter was treated as a potential aviation safety issue. For Graves, this illustrated the problem perfectly. Whatever these objects were, they were operating in an environment occupied by military aircraft, and that created a very real question. What happens if an unidentified object collides with a fighter jet? You don't need an extraterrestrial spacecraft to create a catastrophe, do you? A drone can do that. A conventional aircraft can do that. Even a balloon can do that. Anything occupying the same airspace can potentially become a hazard. And so the argument made by Graves was not necessarily that these objects were alien, it was that the phenomenon deserves serious investigation. So there was another piece of footage, right, called the gimbal. This video shows an object captured by a Navy aircraft's infrared sensor. It appears to move across the screen, and at one point the object appears to rotate, and I'll stick it there, right? The footage became enormously controversial. Some viewers saw evidence of extraterrestrial maneuverability. That is me. I do see that. Others argue that the apparent rotation could be explained by the behaviour of the aircraft sensory system. Well, look, I can't argue with that because I'm not an expert. And this is an important lesson from the entire UAP debate, isn't it? A video can be completely authentic and still be misunderstood. The camera can be real. The object can be real. And yet, right, our interpretation can still be wrong. This is why UAP investigations is so difficult. The mystery isn't simply identifying an object, it's understanding the data. And in the case of Gimbal, the debate continues. Right, and then you've got the GOFAST, a third Navy video officially released by the Department of Defence. 3 pieces of footage, 3 unidentified objects, and years of debate, right? So you've got the FLIR footage, right? You've got the gimbal footage, and you've got the GOFAST footage. The Pentagon confirmed the footage was genuine. But again, that doesn't mean the Pentagon confirmed the objects were extraterrestrial, because let's face it, they never will do, right? The official Bazira was much narrower, right? The footage was authentic. The phenomenon remains unidentified. And that leaves us with the central mystery. So now the story becomes to come together, don't they, right? You've got David Fravor in the Pacific, one extraordinary encounter in 2004. You've got Ryan Graves in the Atlantic, okay, repeated reports from military aviators years later, different objects, different circumstances, different evidence, right? Yet both stories eventually arrive at the same destination. And we are talking about Washington, D.C., the United States Congress, right? July the 26th, 2023, David Fravor and Ryan Graves would sit beside David Grusch and testify publicly about unidentified anomalous phenomena. I hate that word, UFOs, right? Three witnesses, three different perspectives. Grusch brought the intelligence story. Fravor brought the direct encounter, and Graves brought the aviation safety story. And for a few hours, the subject that had spent decades living on the margins of American and British culture was sitting directly in front of Congress. The hearing was watched around the world. Members of Congress asked questions about national security, government transparency, and that's important, that is, military encounters, and unidentified objects operating around American forces. Fravor described his experience during the Nimitz incident. Graves discussed the encounters reported by Navy aviators, and Grusch described what he had learned during his intelligence work. But something else was happening, right? The language had changed. The term UFO was increasingly being replaced by another phrase, and I understand why. Unidentified anomalous phenomena, UAP. The terminology sounded more scientific, less culturally loaded, and perhaps that was appropriate because the question was no longer simply, do you believe in UFOs? And I do. It was, what are these objects? Where did they come from? What technology do they represent? Are they American? Are they British? Are they Chinese? Are they foreign? Are they natural? Are they sensor related? Or something we have not yet to understand? And perhaps most importantly, are they a threat? But before we decide what these stories mean, we need to consider what they don't prove. There is currently no publicly verified evidence demonstrating that the Nimitz object was extraterrestrial. I personally think it was myself. There is no publicly verified evidence that GIMBAL depicts alien technology. I personally think it does. And there is no public scientific census identifying any of these videos as evidence of non-human spacecrafts. But I think they do, right? There are conventional possibilities. We've got to cover that, aren't we? Aircrafts, possibly. No, I don't think they were. Drones. No, they're not drones. Classified technology. No, I don't think they are classified technology. Atmospheric phenomena. No. Sensory artifacts. No, not buying that. Misidentification. No, I'm not buying that any combination of several different explanations, possibly. A mystery is not automatically evidence of aliens. Of course it isn't. But I believe these are alien. But there is another side. Of course, right? The existence of possibly conventional explanations doesn't automatically mean every case has been solved. That distinction matters. The honest position isn't necessarily belief, and it isn't necessarily disbelief. Could it sit in the middle? It is. We don't know yet, isn't it? So what does the footage really show? FLIR shows another unidentified object recorded by a Navy system. GIMBAL shows another identified object or unidentified object. GOFAST shows another. The Pentagon confirmed the videos were genuine naval footage, but the objects themselves remain unidentified in the official release. And that is where the evidence ends for now. So the bigger question, perhaps these objects are technological. Perhaps they are natural. Perhaps some are sensor artifacts. Perhaps the cases being grouped together as UAP represent dozens of completely unrelated phenomena. Or perhaps there is something generally new hiding among them, something we haven't identified, something we don't understand, something we haven't even imagined. David Fravor didn't have the answer. Ryan Graves doesn't have it either. David Grusch doesn't have it, and neither does anyone else publicly. But all three men have done something important. They have put their names behind their accounts. They have appeared publicly. They have answered questions, and they have helped move a subject once dismissed as fringe into the mainstream conversation. And that's really, really important. So let's return to where the story began, the Tic Tac. a small white object above the Pacific Ocean, a fighter pilot watching it from his cockpit, a Navy sensor recording another encounter years later, a video released to the public, and still no definitive answers. Look at the footage. Ask yourself, what do you think you're seeing? A revolutionary piece of evidence, a misunderstanding sensor image, a conventional object behaving in an unusual way possibly, or something that still has no satisfactory explanation? We don't know. And perhaps that's what makes the mystery so compelling, because the real story isn't that David Fravor saw an alien. He didn't claim that. The real story is that highly trained military aviators are encountering objects that they cannot identify. So what do you think? Right, the skies are still being watched. Radar is still scanning. Pilots are still flying, and reports of unidentified objects continue to arrive. Now, perhaps one day a piece of evidence will finally close the case, but I doubt that very much. Perhaps a recovered object will conclusively identify something something UAP-ish, but I don't think that'll happen. Perhaps sensors will capture something so clear that there will be no argument left. But look, if that ever happened, that footage will be confiscated, right? Or perhaps the mystery will continue generation after generation, because we will never be told the truth. The hardest mysteries aren't the one without answers. They're the ones where the evidence keeps giving us just enough to ask another question. David Fravor saw something over the Pacific. Fravor Graves heard the reports of something over the Atlantic. David Grusch followed a trail through the intelligence world. 3 men, 3 paths, 1 mystery. And somewhere between the cockpit and the radar screen and the classified files, perhaps the truth is waiting. But we will never know it. I hate to sound negative, if that's the word. The government will never tell you. All right, the government will never tell you. So this was UFO, aliens and weird stuff. Thanks for sticking around. I really appreciate it. I much appreciate it. And catch me on the next one. Thank you.